Thank you, Anita. In the interest of time, maybe if we could invite the three presenters up to sit in front here, and then because we are running late and we're all going to need a cup of coffee soon, if we could ask several questions, not take the time to answer each one, and then allow the panelists to answer. So please, Anita, Adriana, and Veronica just disappeared, so it looks like you're going to be the ones to bear the brunt of the questioning. And if I could invite people in the audience to ask, there's one, to ask, a series of questions that we'll answer sequentially. So, are there questions that you'd like to address to any of the presenters?
Yeah, maybe sorry, thank you so much for the great presentations. My name is Veronica with Boston University. Veronica, you gave a very interesting kind of overview of many things in Latin America in terms of expenditure, generic drugs versus similares versus out-of-pocket expenditure, etc. So you touched upon very, very important issues for our discussion today. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the fact that you said there is a gap in our information and out-of-pocket expenditure and how much that means for total pharmaceutical expenditure. You said we have a rough idea, it's 50 to 80% out of total pharmaceutical expenditure. However, it seems to be such a critical data point that we need in order to measure our progress towards universal health coverage. And you made that point, we don't have a good or accurate figure. So I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more how we can come to a better estimate on that, because I think it's needed for measuring, as I said, measuring progress towards universal health coverage. And I had one other question for the Brazilian presentation. I really enjoyed that, and I think it brought a wealth of important points to discuss during the day. One thing that you mentioned was the public production of medicines, and I was wondering how important is it for Brazil, and how important do you see that for our discussion for other Latin American countries? In other words, is that something exceptional that only applies to Brazil? Mm-hmm. And in which way you think that might be important for other countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Well, thank you, Gabriela Sutalaguerra from the Department of History of Science here at Harvard. I thank you all three for really wonderful presentations. My question is for Anita. Anita, I was really struck by your presentation, and in particular the prices, right? Because you mentioned that these were prices that were perceived to be valued that were lower than were expected. So I have a question about regulatory bodies with regards to those prices in these new types of drugs. Given the Martin Shkreli case here in the United States with regard to the price of pharmaceuticals, if you see that at all changing with regard to the drugs that you are looking at, if that has had an influence at all with regard to how one values what is an affordable medication.
And maybe one final question? Yes, please.
Ramesh Govindraj from the World Bank. Really enjoyed all the three presentations, so thank you very much. A quick comment and then perhaps a question. I think one of the conundrums that we face is that pharmaceuticals sit at the nexus of health, industry, and trade. And in many countries, pharmaceutical policy is industrial policy first, and health policy is sort of a secondary consideration, which determines a lot of the kinds of policy mechanisms that are actually used to sort of either regulate it or promote it, as the case may be. Which I think leads to, and those of us working in the health sector tend to view it more narrowly from a health perspective and what benefits ought to accrue to the health sector. So there's sort of a note which I think was alluded to, but perhaps didn't come out as explicitly, that this need to promote pharmaceuticals as industrial policy quite often dictates the approach taken by governments. And then a question with regard to value. We've been talking about value in the context of specific drugs. Have there been sort of approaches which have been taken globally towards sort of a more sort of collective view of the value of pharmaceuticals vis-a-vis other sectors, as you just saw, which have been sort of used as the basis for deciding on how prices and other such things might be regulated in the pharmaceutical sector.
Wonderful. So some very provocative questions, and I think. Okay, one final one.
Sorry, my name is Carlos Gadelho from Brazil, Pharmaceutical Foundation. I have three brief questions. Veronica, I'm sure I was a public maker, public policy maker. I'm sure that it's impossible to have a regional agency. It's impossible, I can assure. But what are other means to some kind of convergence, some kind of agreement? Because a regional agency historically, institutionally is very difficult, in my opinion. Congratulations for all the representation, they are very good. But at the very base, I begin to think about if a drug presents better results, it may be unaffordable. Then how can we deal? I think it's a good way, but other ways to change the business model, I think it's necessary in this industry because it's a real problem. And Adriano, I will be very brief here, but I thought very interesting that you relate price with industrial policy. They are not different subjects. Competition is good for price and for innovation. Only to give you, but I'd like to listen something about this. Congratulations.
So wonderful. Let's give our panelists a chance to respond, and then we'll move toward a break, and we have the rest of the day, and I'm sure they would be happy to continue to respond to your questions, but please, you should take some time.
I will start with your question about this regional regulatory agency. What I see right now, of course I think is a dream. What I see right now is that every country is doing something different, and no country can do it by itself. And no country can start doing visit to India to try to see and inspect the plants. I mean, that's impossible also. So some kind of infrastructure, some kind of framework to make these regulations possible is needed. And probably you in Brazil are the ones with the most experience, so probably you will start leading the way, yeah? So that's for you. Regarding Veronica, regarding your question on methodology, we can talk later about that. I don't know if everybody could be interested, but the only thing that I can say is that there is some information in the household consumption surveys, and that can be a starting point. Those surveys are done every 5, 7, 6 years, and sometimes in some countries once every decade. So the information is old, but it can be a starting point. On top, those trends do not change overnight. It takes actually sometimes a decade to change. So anyways, it's good information. Yeah? We can talk later about that.
So thank you for the question. Brazil has an important tradition with public production. Fiocruz is the 10th most important pharmaceutical producer in Brazil. And we have 26, 27, I think, public laboratories. So they are very important in the period of time that was to produce drugs that don't have pharmaceutical interest in the private sector. So they are important for this. But with the new drugs, since 2008, they become important as a strategic player to receive the technology and to this technology be appropriated by the public sector. So, and this is very important in a perspective of it's a very competitive market. So if you have one public player, it could be important in this strategy. I don't know if it's possible to apply for all the region or for all the countries, because it's a very particular context in Brazil. Maybe in a regional agenda, if we have countries thinking about in a cooperation of regulatory agency, and Brazil certainly can be a regional player. I think this is the importance of the public producers.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. So I'll take one of the questions first, which was, is there approaches that look more broadly on pharmaceuticals within a broader set of priority setting in health systems? And I want to refer you to our colleague Christine, who is sitting here. Could you identify, maybe in the break you could connect with Christine, who has a study currently underway looking at what New Zealand and Belgium are doing with in terms of taking a broader view at societal priority setting for multiple different health interventions. Admittedly, still health, not necessarily education, but I'll defer that question to you, Christine. And then I'd like to take the other questions around value regulation and a different business model or a different thinking into a thought experience in this a thought experiment in this slide that I skipped, because I hope it might help us to think about that. It's this slide here. So if I could just briefly try to have us think through that. So in any new good that comes into a market has what is at the bottom. It incurs costs to develop it, and then it incurs the R&D costs, costs for production and commercializing the good, and then a margin that the company that makes it needs to make in order to make it worthwhile for the company to have that good manufactured. So a margin, and then the overall value, the value that for me, if I want to buy a red BMW, it has a certain value for me that is this piece that I'm willing to pay a price that is composed of the value to me, the value to the company, and the costs incurred to make this. Now, when we so this is not the pharmaceutical sector. This is other goods in an economy. So now let me skip some things here, and let me get to this item number 3. Let's forget about the left and right bar heights, because that would get us a little bit distracted right now. It's a measure. It's a way to identify uncertainty in the system on the value. But what we are doing in pricing drugs is that we now do so-called value-based pricing, and we use health technology assessment to do so, which has its role in that it sets a upper level, be it $50,000 per quality or be it $150,000 per quality. We set an upper level, and we equate in these calculations costs with price, because we don't know costs, because costs are only known by the manufacturer. Therefore, we cannot. So we don't know this. We don't know this, and we don't know this. We set a value-based price, and we say at this price we would fund the drug. And what this does is it shrinks. The drug will be priced at that value if the manufacturer wants it in the system. What it does, it shrinks the value to the healthcare system or to the social system, because that value that the red BMW gives to me is now in the margin that is admittedly unknown, because we don't know what's down here. That's not published information. All of this is together. So what we do need is we need to get to something like this, where the value of the drug is is split between the value that is allocated to the healthcare system and the value that's allocated to the manufacturer, so that there's an incentive to produce this drug, there must be an incentive to do the R&D, but there also must be a possibility for some of this value to accrue to the payer. And that is not the case when we price drugs at the cost effectiveness threshold and when they come to market like that. So I think we need policies that give us more information, not public, because that is not coming anytime soon, that we really know what these drugs cost. But imagine a production cost is $159 per patient per drug supply per year. The drug price I told you at the moment is the list price, not the negotiated price, is $140,000 per patient per year. So arguably for some drugs, and the Shkreli experiment of course was one, there is outrageous profit. And if we knew some more, maybe between the regulator and the company, maybe not the public because that's unlikely, if we knew some more where the true cost is in manufacturing and the commercialization, then maybe there could be a discussion around the margin and around a fair split of the margin. And that is, I think, where we need to go towards. So I hope that's
Wonderful. Thank you, Anita, and thank you to all three of our presenters. We could go on and on, of course, but why don't we pause here? I think we're now at 10:54. Maybe if we could try to aim to come back at 11:15, which will be eating into the next session by about 15 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have more opportunity later in the day to come back to some of these issues. Thank you very much.